Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. And today, Talli, for our 50th episode, we'll be talking about sex and relationships over 50 as people navigate midlife and later. And when I told Eliza that we're doing this for our 50th episode, she said she wanted to know what we're going to do for our 100th episode, which I thought was an interesting question.
That's actually funny. We were talking about, yesterday was the 75th birthday of the State of Israel, and we were remembering that at the 50th Chidon HaTanakh, Bibi Netanyahu was there as prime minister. And of course, yesterday as the 75th birthday of the State of Israel, Bibi Netanyahu was there as prime minister. So we were wondering what would happen in the 100th. Because Hashem, we're all around still by then.
Do you remember the movie Groundhog Day?
Exactly. But we're not a political podcast, so we'll end with that.
We'll get to our topic in just a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment as well. Please tell people about Intimate Judaism and share this podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. And we know that you have been. The release date of our last episode 49, had the highest ratings of any individual day over the 5 seasons of this podcast. The first week after release had the highest ratings of any week, and the first 30 days had the highest ratings of any 30 days. So we thank you all for doing so, and please keep spreading the word. Join the Intimate Judaism team on Patreon. Patreon supporters get bonus episodes, merch, and more. You can find the link in the description of this podcast as well as in the show notes. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. And Talli, let's get right into our topic today. Can you give a brief introduction about what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, first of all, just to comment on what you were saying about the numbers, I'm so happy to hear that this podcast is so popular. We don't really have exact breakdown of the demographics in terms of age. I know that we have a lot of young people who listen, and I know that we have a lot of couples throughout the life cycle. I know that we do get several requests to talk about sex and intimacy in long-term relationships. What is meant by long-term relationships? Well, according to the literature, that could be anything from like 6 months to 2 years to 25 years to 50 years. But I'm assuming that we need and should do an episode on changes in intimate and sexual life in midlife and beyond. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
So we know that midlife brings with it physical changes, physical challenges. But you told me, Talli, before we went on the air that it seems that the physical issues are perhaps less acute and less determinative than emotional issues that accompany aging. That said, could you first briefly outline some of the typical physical issues associated with aging, both for women and for men? And then perhaps we can transition to talking about some of the more common reasons for changes in a couple's sex life as they age.
Okay, I think that's a great question. I just want to clarify a little bit about that statement that emotional issues are more indicative or more important than physical issues, because I don't think it's exactly that way. I think that what I want to put out there is that we recognize that there are various contributors to sexual life, and there are various contributors to the changes that take place in a couple's intimate life over the long haul. So there's one strong school of thought, and we could call this sexology or sexual medicine, that tends, when they talk about sexuality over the life cycle at midlife and beyond, they tend to focus on the variables of sexual functioning. Those variables being physical, what happens medically, what happens hormonally, what happens with chronic illness or disease, what happens with certain medications, what happens with menopause, what happens with andropause, and how does that affect the functional variables? How does that affect sexual desire? How does that affect sexual arousal? How does that affect the erection, orgasm, lubrication, all of those variables? And they're pretty medical, they're pretty functional variables. And what I want to present is a far more inclusive view, because even those variables are also very individual. They don't even really look at the dynamics between what's going on. So what we know about midlife, particularly over the long term, is there are a lot of societal ideas or even myths about the idea of passion and desire in terms of what people think. People we'll often think, in the media often supports this, that sex is the best when you get married, or when you're together, depending on the social milieu, when you're young. It's hot, it's sexy, you're beautiful, and you can just keep going. And as you age, especially if it's a long-term relationship, and we all know that familiarity can breed boredom, as they say, it just gets harder to keep it alive, to keep it vibrant. And so that kind of understanding is that as we age, of course, sex isn't as good. So that's a myth that we need to look at and bust. But the other thing is that it's not just about the physical variables, and that in fact, while those physical changes may pretty much be fixed in terms, they're not fixed, obviously they're different for everybody, but let's say the idea that people are going to age, the idea that people are going to have changes in their sexual function, that's a pretty fixed idea. So the question is, assuming that happens, does that necessarily mean that the sex life is going to be less satisfactory? And that already is a whole conversation that we can have, because in fact, the studies show that regardless of actual physical function, couples will report optimal sexual experiences, more connected, more mindful, more intentional, more passionate even sex, because of other important variables that we can talk about. Does that mean that the physical stuff does not count? Absolutely not. Obviously it counts. And with all of that introduction, I can answer your very broad question, which was, well, what are those changes?
Right. I'd like to go into all the other issues as well. But as an introduction, I think the physical changes will sort of set a baseline, and then we can move on from there.
Okay. So look, I think, when we said it's our 50th episode and we're going to devote it to, 50 and beyond, generally speaking, 50 marks midlife. For a little before, a little after. If we look at the couples have been married for around, 20, 25, 30 years by then. Kids are older teenagers. Some kids are getting married. There's that whole kind of social identity that, we're becoming in-laws. We have children getting married, sometimes starting the whole stage of grandparenting. So there's a lot of new roles that we take on. If there are children still living at home, they come, they go. It's kind of hard to find any quiet time. It's not like you put them to bed at 7:30 like when you were in your 20s and 30s. So there are those changes. As far as physically, obviously, so for women, the monthly cycle, depending on whether there's hormonal intervention or not, birth control, etc., the menstruation cycle begins to wane. So the regular once a month cycle begins to change. There are changes that are very variable in women depending on individual factors having to do with them and also if they're on hormones. But let's just say that over time, the levels of estradiol, which is the estrogen, begins to go down. The FSH, which is the follicle stimulating hormone, begins to go up. And so there are some changes. The sex hormone changes also change the variables of sexual functioning in terms of there often being some sensory changes. There's often being some changes in lubrication in the vagina for women. There might be less desire felt. There might be some changes in the pelvic floor. There's also the symptoms of menopause, the hot flashes, the kind of overall also kind of not knowing when and if you're going to get a period. Sometimes there's heavy bleedings. Okay, so there's that whole kind of experience of going through changes in your body as a woman. In addition to that, as we go further into aging, there's changes in the body. There might be aches and pains. There might be some chronic illnesses that people develop, whether it's, arthritis or diabetes or those kinds of things, depending on overall health. I mean, sexual health is part of overall health. So while there might be urogenital issues in women, breast incontinence or prolapse or, just new things that come up, similar things can happen in men as well as they begin to age. Often men will have prostate issues or growth of their prostate. And so this can affect their urinary habits. They may get up often at night. They may also be dealing with health issues, diabetes, or just overall decrease in their health. Now, this obviously, we see men and women in their 50s and their 60s. Let's count us amongst them who are in great shape, who are, thank God, doing great, exercising, this may not really resonate because, first of all, people do live longer and they are healthier later in life. And I have to say, this whole idea of giving a laundry list of symptoms is exactly what I hate to do. It's exactly what lectures in the world of sexual medicine have always been about. This is what menopause looks like. It's really depressing. You're going to feel this way and that way, and it's going to ruin your sex life. This is what andropause looks like. You're going to have to worry about getting harder, more sustainable erections because men do have changes in their erectile function. Again, it's that idea of maybe you need Viagra or maybe you need this. And, maybe like men also can feel like, oh, I have less sperm volume. Like, does that mean there's something wrong with my manliness? Is there something wrong with me? They may have changes in the intensity of their orgasm. They might feel some burning. So there is a lot of recognizing of subtle changes in the actual sexual functioning itself that exists for both men and for women. That's just an overview. But again, there's a lot more to talk about than those things.
And can you explain for a moment, Talli, why do you hate those laundry lists of symptoms? Is it that they're not necessarily true, or is it because it minimizes the issue into something that is not necessarily accurate? What exactly is the problem with expressing what is commonly true medically?
I think that there is a sense that all of sexual function is dependent on these changes, and these changes get pathologized. Now, I'm not saying that you should not treat an issue that is an issue. That's what medicine is for. I'm just saying that we do not need to necessarily predict that these changes are going to be the end of your sex life or are necessarily going to make you less sexual or less interested in sex or are going to be the demise of your sex life, just as I don't believe that familiarity necessarily breeds sexual boredom.
In that case, can we, again, avoiding laundry lists, but could we perhaps talk about some psychological issues, not physical issues per se, but psychological issues that are associated with menopause, with andropause, with aging in general, that can affect a couple's sex life?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's the individual psychological issues, and then there's kind of like the relational psychological and social issues. So again, not to go into this laundry list because there are going to be many men and many women who report that this part of their life is what they have been waiting for the past 20 years, that they feel great as they approach their 50s or even 60s, that they are free of obligation, that they're working towards retirement, that they are mentally very healthy and feel good about themselves. So this is definitely not necessarily going to be the case. But there are going to be people who do have difficulty kind of confronting the empty nest, confronting changes in their professional life, or if a woman has been very much a homemaker, she might be confronting, who am I now if I don't have a profession? Sometimes the couple is confronting their coupleness. If our marriage was very much a co-parenting kind of administrative thing that worked, but we didn't really have that much together as a couple, what do we do now? There's also this idea of dealing with new identities and new roles. Again, I'm not trying to frame it as pathological necessarily. I'm just saying these are some of the potential psychological issues. Often there's work stress, there's ageism. If you're in high tech and you're in your 50s, you may be constantly afraid that they're going to fire you and get younger people in your place. There's a certain vulnerability that comes along with the stage in life professionally, unless you're very deeply confident about what you have achieved professionally. Also, the menopausal hormonal changes may also, in fact, create some depression, some anxiety, certainly having a very symptomatic type of menopausal experience with a lot of hot flashes, sleeplessness, night sweats, certainly will have an impact on how menopause is experienced psychologically. Some people experience menopause in a very positive way. I always like to tell the story that I read in a book once called Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom by Christian Northrup. And she talks about how, you'll appreciate this because you're from Boston, but I think she came from Maine. And she said it was freezing one night. It was absolutely freezing one night. And she was debating if she should get up to get another blanket. And then all of a sudden she had a hot flash. And she talks about how this hot flash just completely warmed her body. And she, so it's really about how you can become mindful and reframe the symptom into something positive. I always like that story because it's really about not necessarily experiencing changes as attacks on you, but somehow being able to integrate those changes as something that is supposed to happen.
That's really a good story. I like that too. I want to ask you about something you said a few minutes ago regarding the common myths that are associated with aging. And you obviously have mentioned some of them in passing. Perhaps you can mention some others that are simply not true or not necessarily accurate. And in addition to talking about those myths, I'd also like to know, why is it important to dispel them? On some level, meaning who cares? You said these myths are sometimes damaging. Well, okay, people will find out they're not true when they reach that level. So why does it matter?
Well, they may or they may not find out that that's true, because if you believe myths, then you'll experience them in the way that you believe them. So you asked me for a few myths. There are several. So for example, sex is really only for the young. It's only for the able-bodied and only for the attractive. The idea that once you lose your look, so to speak, you're no longer sexually attractive, or you're no longer sexually attractive to your partner. And that's really a myth, because it's just not true. And that's not only from anecdotal evidence. There's also studies that back this up. That great sex only happens in the honeymoon stages. It only happens at the beginning of the marriage, and then over time is likely to just diminish. And this whole kind of idea of how do you sustain passion and desire in the long term? I mean, that's a very common dilemma, in the sense that, yes, it's true that passion and desire that comes from the lack of really knowing the person that well, that particular type of passion and desire isn't going to be there in a long-term relationship when there is such a deep sense of intimacy and knowledge of each other. But that does not necessarily mean that there isn't a different kind of passion and desire, which is based on different parts of that same thing. So for example, if we're going to say that familiarity breeds boredom, and that really couples need to have novelty, and this is why monogamy is such a problem, because you know everything about the person and what can possibly be new. I'm going to be bringing you some results of a very interesting study from Canada. So this is one of the findings from the study. I don't want to act like I've made this stuff up myself. So I'm going to tell you one thing that was very interesting about the study. One of the things that this study showed was that, yes, it's true that novelty is what is necessary to kind of keep the passion alive, but that novelty is not necessarily something that can only be experienced with new partners or different positions that you can't get into when you're, let's say, 70. Rather, when there is a deep sense of safety and emotional intimacy, then partners feel comfortable enough to take risks to try new things together. So in a way, familiarity breeds intimacy, which then breeds safety to allow the space to create novelty, to try new things, to introduce different ideas into the bedroom.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. Other myths are that older people don't even have sex. Once you get into your 70s, into your 80s, you're not interested in sex. Sexuality is something for young people. It's related to procreation, but also sexual interest, and that sexual interest declines as you age. And a lot of our Hollywood stereotypes have certainly perpetuated those beliefs. And also, you get older and you have disabilities, chronic illnesses, and those obviously mark the end of people's sex lives. That's definitely a myth and a false belief. Also, there's like this concept called sexual ageism. And this was studied by actually an Israeli researcher, Ataret Meidan-Gewirtz. And she looked at the idea that sexual ageism very negatively informs attitudes about older people and their sexuality, to the extent that physicians believe that older people don't have sex anymore. They don't ask, anyway, they tend to avoid the topic of sex, but they're not comfortable asking older people about their sex lives, or if they have any functional issues that they might want to raise. There are false expectations around older people being interested in sex because of the belief that ideals around sexuality stem from beauty and physical attractiveness. And also because there's been such a kind of emphasis on the biomedical aspects of sex, once those biomedical aspects kind of materialize, there's an assumption that, sex is no longer on the table anyway. And all of these things are kind of products of sexual ageism.
Interesting. I want to ask you about what you mentioned a moment ago regarding the ability to increase passion even as people get older, because I read an essay that you wrote, and I'm going to quote you now, Talli. While menopause and andropause can affect the specific domains of sexual functioning, such as arousal, desire, and quality of orgasm, many studies have indicated that despite this, older adults report greater overall sexual satisfaction. And despite what you said before, this still seems somewhat paradoxical that it would actually be greater satisfaction. It sounds, from what you said before, that they can still enjoy it, but it wouldn't necessarily be greater. So can you explain this paradox, how that's so?
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to. So there's a few elements to that. There's a few different studies on sexuality in older adults that kind of look at the disparity between the variables of sexual functioning themselves. And also, we have to also understand that a lot of sexual studies define sex as intercourse, sexual intercourse, and that the ability to be able to engage in sexual intercourse with all the variables that are necessary, being free of pain and being able to penetrate and all of that stuff, that may decline in couples. But unless you're specifically studying that variable, we won't know if that's necessarily linked to a decline in sexual satisfaction. We also don't know if it's linked to an increase in distress. In other words, there may be couples who will say we're having less frequency of sex, but we aren't distressed about it. And in fact, there's a lot less pressure around having sex. And in fact, it's fine for us to just lay in bed and cuddle. And it provides a great deal of satisfaction for us. And sometimes it can be more than that. So it's really about how a couple experiences their sexuality together and less about how many times they do it, how many orgasms they've had or didn't, how many positions they can get into, whether it's an issue of like measuring the time it takes to have an erection. What we look at really, just even as practitioners, is what are the variables around sexual experiencing? So for example, let's take something very functional. And I people know that I deal less with specific issues of function and more with the relationship, but sex therapists have to also be able to deal with function. So let's say you asked about changes. Let's say one kind of sexual script for a couple is that they would have some kind of, foreplay and then have intercourse. And that foreplay, because of the nature of the guy's sexual arousal and the nature of her sexual arousal, they never actually did a lot of physical touch. Like the woman didn't regularly touch her husband's penis as part of sexual play. He would just get aroused by himself. And when it was time for intercourse, they would have intercourse. Let's just say, and that was fine for both of them. Let's say he struggled with premature ejaculation, so he really didn't want to be touched because that would set him off or whatever. Then they get to be in their 50s and he needs some amount of physical stimulation in order to get erect. And that's a change. And, that's something that needs to kind of be talked about and communicated. If you don't have a language, if you don't have communication to say, listen, I'm going to need a little help here, and this is how you do it, even though they've been married for several years, then, that needs to be there. So when we talk about kind of like sexual experiences versus sexual functioning variables, we're talking about the variables of being able to communicate. We're talking about connection, safety, closeness, sense of humor. You have to have a sense of humor, vulnerability, playfulness, risk-taking. When I say risk-taking, when you're in sexual health, when you think risk, you're thinking, not using birth control or, risk of transmitted disease. That's not what I mean here by risk. Risk-taking is I'm going to take the risk to be emotionally vulnerable and tell you what I'd really like to try. And I'm going to risk the idea that you might be shocked or make fun of me or devalue me. But because I have such intimacy with you and because I have safety and because I know you know me, I have a pretty good feeling that you're not going to do that to me. And so that creates this ability to introduce novelty and to kind of create new meanings around sex, create new ways to, experience sex.
Then, Talli, perhaps could you sum this up? I assume the answer in part will involve communication because we've been doing this for quite a while. But could you give some practical pointers, perhaps for people who are older, who want to have what we're describing, which was a greater desire, a greater arousal, greater passion, but maybe they don't experience that yet. That's not their experience, and they would like to find out a way to do that, and they would like to try to make their sex lives better, even though maybe it has actually diminished, unlike the experience of other couples. What practically would you recommend to them?
Okay, so look, I don't know if it's just about practical. I mean, practical is to be able to say, to communicate, to be able to talk to each other. I would say to create a kind of balance of reciprocity. We talk a lot in this podcast about sex as an obligation versus sex as mutual and consensual. There's actually one study on sexual obligation and how that pans out in midlife. And that study, it's a very recent study actually, and it showed that women who report sex out of obligation report a lot less sexual satisfaction than women who report having sex out of the desire to make their partners happy. There's a very nuanced difference between those two things. So this idea of wanting to make my partner happy, because again, we can go back to previous podcasts and understand that spontaneous physiological desire may not necessarily be there the same way it might have been in the past. And so having motivation to take the time for sex, to not believe that it's necessarily something that's going to happen spontaneously, because it may not happen unless you create the time and place for it. Understanding that there are changes in the relationship and addressing the way that we kind of have a natural flow in the relationship. The relationship might change. And if we notice, for example, like conflicts around certain things, or one partner develops some kind of existential crisis or anxiety, or there's a death of a parent, there's a natural flow of relationships, and being able to acknowledge them, address them, and kind of deal with them as they come up. I do want to respond to your previous question about practical tips. I don't want it to sound like I'm completely ignoring the functional issues, because functional issues are of importance. And especially if you kind of get used to doing things in a specific way, and that's what has always worked. So I do want to address what's available when there are actual sexual functioning issues. So first, I would say that you should talk to your provider, if it's your primary doctor or your gynecologist or a urologist, because really doctors are, or at least should be, trained to be able to offer solutions to certain sexual health functioning issues. And if they can't or they won't, then I would ask them for a referral to a physician who is trained in sexual health. So that's number one. Number two, understanding that sexual function is part of general health and well-being. So by, in general, having a lifestyle that is constantly kind of aware of diet and exercise and living a healthy lifestyle, that's going to generally be correlated with better sexual functioning. But obviously, there are going to be situations that diet and exercise are not going to necessarily address. So, for example, in women with the changes, and I mentioned something about genital changes, there definitely is going to be noticeable dryness for many women, and many women will remember having vaginal dryness perhaps from after childbirth. And so using a lubricant can be very important and can be very helpful. Often a lubricant kind of gets you started so that you can kind of get into it and enjoy it more. Using a lubricant just to allow intercourse to take place without any sort of expectation for pleasure, that's a bit controversial, but I suppose it's your decision to do that. But that's not really what it's meant for. The idea is that sex really should be completely mutual and consensual. So even if you're not having orgasms with intercourse, the ability to enjoy and have pleasure with intercourse is something that is important. It's something that a good lubricant can help. What type of lubricant is good for you? is also something that you can talk to your doctor about, because a lot of it has to do with your own personal, what we call pH levels, the levels of acid or alkaline in your vagina. So some women do better with silicone-based lubricants and others do better with water-based lubricants. Some people talk about using oils that are natural, such as coconut oil, but definitely there's some controversy around using those. I'm personally not a fan. Like I said, I don't give a lot of technical advice. And of course, every woman should speak to her doctor about the possibility of hormone replacement. You can get estrogen cream to apply directly to the vagina, which helps a lot to deal with some of the atrophy that can happen and keep the area more lubricated and moisturized as well. There's also the possibility of hormone replacement systemically, which is also helpful for that, and also helpful for other symptoms of menopause. Another person who would be important to speak to is your kind of local pelvic floor physical therapist, whether you're a man or a woman, because pelvic floor physical therapists are really experts in overall genital health and can give exercises for the pelvic floor, which can be very helpful when there are symptoms, even when it's dryness or sometimes there's actual lack of mobility, because if you have less frequent intercourse, the muscles and soft tissue can atrophy. And so learning exercises to have the blood flow into your pelvic floor, sometimes some stretching can be very helpful in women to stretch the vaginal opening. For men, pelvic floor exercise can be helpful in the erection. But again, if there's a real difficulty with getting or sustaining an erection, sometimes it can be very helpful to speak to the doctor. There are different types of treatments that can be available for erectile issues. And one of them are what's known as PDE5 inhibitors. That's the class of medications such as Viagra, Cialis, Levitra. And most urologists are trained to be able to explain why you would choose one over the other. There are some cases which don't kind of respond to PDE5 inhibitors, and there are other possible solutions for that, sometimes even like a vacuum pump or an injection. And people do choose these interventions in order to enhance their sexual life for themselves and for their partners. And then there are people who choose to have sex in other ways without necessarily needing an erection, or simply because they don't want to do those interventions. Their partner doesn't want them to do those interventions. That's their choice. But I don't think that that choice should come out of not knowing that these things are available. Part of, investing in your sexual pleasure and in your sexual life and in your partner is to look out there for what is medically, from a sexual health perspective, available. So I'm saying all this because I was talking a lot about sexual experience variables, the experiencing variables and the intimacy variables as outweighing the function variables in what creates quote unquote optimal sex. And while I do believe that, I in no way want to discount the importance of the functional variables and to provide as much knowledge as possible that there are ways to address them. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it did, Talli. Thank you. I know you also wanted to introduce some fascinating research that we discussed as well.
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from learning from other people. So a group in Canada that was led by Peggy Kleinplatz, she's a researcher in Ottawa, Canada, and she's a lovely woman, a colleague. She did a study with some colleagues on what are the components of optimal sexual experience. She did what's called phenomenological research by interviewing people who reported having what they self-described as optimal sexual experiences, as having good sex. They did interviews, it's qualitative, and they did interviews with people in long-term relationships, 25 years or more. They actually also interviewed 20 sex therapists, and they interviewed what they call sexual minorities. They wanted to learn, what do we have to learn from people who are LGBTQ, who are kink-oriented, who are disabled? What can we learn from them as well about how to have great sex? She and her colleagues also published a book called Magnificent Sex, Lessons from Extraordinary Lovers. They found basically 8 components of optimal sexual experiences. And I'm going to go through them because I think it'll be really helpful for
Please.
our listeners. So one is the ability to be totally absorbed in the moment. So obviously when people hear that, they're going to say, sure, that's mindfulness. You've talked about mindfulness before. But she says that the way that people describe this is deeper than mindfulness. It's about such a deep level of connection. She was saying that somebody said, you can hear an atom bomb go off and not even notice. And I thought to myself, as somebody who studies and deals a lot with trauma and sexuality, what we know about trauma is that when you've experienced trauma in your life, you may become kind of hypervigilant, unable to relax and let go because you're waiting for the next bomb to drop, so to speak. You have to be adaptive and survive. And so the ability to let go in sex becomes very hard to do. So obviously what she's bringing is this kind of opposite extreme where you're able to be so non-hypervigilant, you're able to be so focused and so connected that you won't even notice when things are happening around you. Number 2 is sharing the connection with your partner. It's having a shared kind of experience with them, which again, you don't have that with what might be described as passionate sex or desired sex, which in the media would be between two strangers. You don't really have a shared connection with them. Yes, you could take emotional risks with them because you'll never see them again. But this idea that you can go to those places with somebody who you know and you know well and you know deeply, and you share things with them is a very important part of the experience. 3 is deep sexual and erotic intimacy. So again, that intimacy is the exposure of your deepest feelings, the exposure of your fantasies, being able to share what you would like and what you would like to try, again, without feeling you're going to get hurt by that. 4 is high levels of empathic communication. And they talked a lot in the book about empathy. We have to recognize that there are definitely different, I would say, theories about sexuality and long-term relationships that look at empathy and connection and intimacy and security as being basically anti-passion. Esther Perel, her entire book, Mating in Captivity, is all about that paradox between how to sustain that feeling of desire when you can't desire what you already have, when you don't really have mystery. Mystery is what breeds desire. So I think we do need to understand that there are different points of view that look at intimacy and empathy and connection and sharing as anti-sexual. There are other points of view, such as those based on emotionally focused therapy, that will look at those factors as actually being positive for the reasons that I've described before. Here again is an example of this qualitative research showing that empathy does increase, and high levels of empathic communication increases the quality of sexual experiences. Number 5 is fun, playfulness, laughter, exploration, and risk-taking. Number 6 is being authentic, coming in with your true self. Number 7 is vulnerability, allowing yourself to be vulnerable. We talked about that before. And then the 8th is what she refers to as transcendence. Transcendence is kind of a difficult concept to kind of explain. But what they say in the book, that transcendence is a sort of result of all of these other elements put together that allow you in your partnership to kind of go beyond their own selves. There's a me, there's a you, and there's an us, and we can transcend everything. It's something a little bit, I would say, more of a spiritual.
It sounds almost
connection.
Spiritual or religious, the way you're describing it.
And she was talking about that too in the study. She was saying how when they were interviewing people, the people would say to them, are you sure you want to hear the down and dirty? We're going to give you a lot of really, you're asking us to talk about our sex lives. Are you sure you want to hear the lowdown on all the things that we do? And they're like, yeah, we can handle it. We're sex researchers. And then they start talking about things like this deep connection, this inertia, this gravity, this feeling connected almost to the universe, to God. Instead of saying these quote unquote, like deep, dirty things, they were talking about things that really did sound more spiritual in a way.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting. It was an interesting book to read. Again, it's called Magnificent Sex by Peggy Kleinplatz and Dana Menard.
As long as we're mentioning an almost religious type of sexual experience, which, by the way, probably is its own episode. There's a lot to talk about there as well. I want to move into something which we haven't really talked about today, atypically for this podcast, which is Jewish law. Because with the onset of menopause and the ending of the need to think about the laws of nidah, which involve being separated on average for a couple of weeks every month, that can change a couple's sex life for the better or for the worse, because there is a narrative, and I'm curious if you think this narrative is actually accurate. The narrative that's often given to a new bride and groom is that while nidah is hard, it's very difficult to be separated. That allows every couple to experience a new type of renewal every month, a new honeymoon. And the process of being separated physically from each other allows that desire to grow and to percolate rather than to become boring. And as a result of nidah, therefore, that's not the reason for nidah, but it is a benefit of nidah, which is that couples have that monthly honeymoon, that monthly coming back together again. The question is, first of all, I don't know if that's actually true according to sex researchers, whether that really is what happens. I'm curious about that. But more to our point, I'm also wondering that when menopause happens, that means that they no longer have that renewal. So how do those two things balance? Is it that if I want to be sort of dan l'chav zchut, if I want to assume the best over here, I could say, yes, that narrative is true. By the time a couple reaches menopause, for most couples, they've been married for decades at that point, and therefore they don't necessarily need that renewal anymore because they've grown together beyond, maybe we can talk about transcendence again, beyond seeing each other in that physical way, so it's not necessary. What would you say about that?
Okay, so to answer your first question about whether or not the nidah laws enhance sexual intimacy or physical satisfaction, that's a good question. We actually were the first, my colleagues and I, Michelle Friedman, Rachel Yehuda, my sister, and I, we put together this study a long time ago, and we published it in 2009, where we surveyed 400 Orthodox Jewish women, and we asked them many questions, not only about their level of adherence to Taharat HaMishpacha, but also their experience of it and what ways they feel that it enhances or does not enhance their relationship. And we had qualitative parts of the study as well as we gathered a lot of quantitative data. And it was really the first groundbreaking study to look at that question. And what we found is that there was a lot of variability, both in how strictly the laws were observed, but also how these laws were experienced. And so many women did report feeling that the renewal and going to the mikvah did enhance them on a spiritual level. They did not report that they felt that it enhanced their sex life. In fact, many women, especially in the qualitative part, talked about the difficulties around going to the mikvah, the difficulties around not being able to be spontaneous with their sex life, having sex according to the calendar, the annoyance of going to the mikvah, of being looked at by mikvah ladies. In fact, I think that today, these things are talked about a lot. You know, if you look at Facebook groups, the Eden Center, which is one of the greatest sources of providing information around this area, they openly teach their college teachers to teach that we know that this isn't always an easy experience for everyone. But that whole beginning of the discourse on mikvah not being idealized, on Taharat HaMishpacha not being idealized, I think started with our study. I think that we also found that some women, and again, we only studied women, by the way, which is a shame.
I wanted to ask, did you also, if men feel the same way? No,
we only studied women, and there's so much to be gained from studying the male experience. But I think that there are women who did report that they really liked it. They liked the monthly flow. And I think that if we talk to couples today, we'll find that many couples don't mind the on and off. And in fact, they got so used to the on and off that not having that anymore is something they need to figure out how to adjust to. Often in terms of like, well, now that it's there all the time, like we never do it, or now that it's there all the time, how do we schedule it? Or how do we decide how often to do it? Whereas for many couples, really just not having it anymore is just this amazing feeling of freedom, this amazing feeling that they can just express touch to one another whenever they want, and to be able to have sex when they both feel like doing it, and not because, uh-oh, it's Tuesday, we have 2 days left. I know I'm going to get my period, or that kind of thing. I do think that the adjustment issue is a personal one. It's a relational one. It's something that every couple kind of needs to navigate. But for the most part, just anecdotally from my clinical work, I think that many couples find it very freeing, and also not worrying about birth control is very freeing.
Okay, Talli, now going back to what you mentioned before my previous question about those 8 different things: mutuality, empathic communication, risk-taking, transcendence. So how does a couple get to that? They sound like they're skills rather than something which comes naturally. So how does a couple achieve that?
Well, in this study, they actually addressed the question of, how do you get to these optimal experiences? How do you experience great sex or magnificent sex when you are in a long-term relationship and when you are getting older? And what they talked about was, for one thing, you need to unlearn everything that you had been taught about sexuality in long-term relationships, about sexuality in the media, about all the myths around the fact that sex is for beautiful people, that sex is for the young. In fact, understanding that great lovers are not born, they're made. You have to take the time to work at it. In fact, Peggy gives an example of, you can be hungry and go get a hamburger at McDonald's, is what she said, even though she doesn't eat hamburgers at McDonald's, but she just used that example. Or you can take your time and make this beautiful meal, or go to this fancy restaurant and really invest and make it a priority. This idea of intentionality, this idea of mindfulness, this idea of believing that it's something important. And in fact, other studies, now that I recall it, have looked at sex being important. Believing that sex is important is a predictor for reporting sexual satisfaction in later life. So it's really about, making the effort, showing the effort. It's also about overcoming shame and guilt, about, fantasies, about things that you think might be wrong with you, and just being able to accept who you are sexually. And that's not always easy if you are not vanilla, or if you're not heterosexual. I mean, those can be challenging, especially in our culture. They talk about how it takes time, it takes devotion, it takes intentionality, and that it's not about normal sexual functioning. Normal sexual functioning may not be necessary, and it also may not even be sufficient. She talks about how she knows couples who have perfectly normal sexual functioning, but do not have a good sex life. And I can really relate to this. I could say the same thing. And then there are couples who don't have the basic elements for whatever reason, illness or disability or medication, but will report having a wonderful experience together. And that it's not about the orgasms, and it's not necessarily about the penetrative intercourse, but that there are so many other really important factors that go into being able to value and maintain and sustain and perpetuate passion, eroticism, desire, love, showing love, making love over time.
Okay, Talli, I know there's a lot more to say about this, but I do have one final question before we go for today. You talked about predictors right now, but in that same essay that I quoted before, you also mentioned that the best predictor of a quality sexual life after menopause is a quality of sexual life before menopause. Could you just explain what you meant by that as a final idea?
Well, it's kind of like, the guy breaks his finger and he says, "Doctor, will I be able to play piano again?" And the doctor said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, "Oh, good, because I couldn't play piano before." Oh, it's that same thing. I mean, it's not likely, it's not highly likely that if you've had problems in your sex life in the past, that going through menopause is necessarily going to improve it. I suppose it could happen for various reasons, especially if those problems were based on the cycle of on and off. But in general, the literature shows that for people who report satisfaction in general, they're likely to report satisfaction with changes, or when there are certain variables that have been changed. It's like anything else. So if you found sex to be valuable and important to you in the past, and you really kind of invested in it, or you've prioritized it, then chances are you're going to continue to do so in the future.
Okay, Talli, thank you so much for everything you explained today. I know the heavy load was on you today rather than on me, and it was really interesting. So I appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners do as well, hearing all of the wisdom that you imparted. In particular, I was taken by those 8 different things. To me, that's something that really is a major take-home that is quite important. I'd love to look into that even more because there's a lot there to discuss, and maybe we'll do so in further episodes. And thank you for listening to another episode of Intimate Judaism. Remember to go to intimatejudaism.com for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism on your favorite podcast provider. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com. See you next time.
Bye.